folks. Welcome to the Colorism Healing YouTube channel. I am Dr. Sarah Webb, and today I want to talk about why it's scary to talk about colorism. Now, I have 5 reasons that had in the past kept me from talking about colorism for all of my early life, throughout my childhood, teenage years, and early 20s. It was the very first blog post I ever wrote about why it had taken me so long to speak up about colorism. And I looked back on that post recently and I realized that those fears are still relevant today, and those fears did take me years to overcome. So although now I talk freely and openly about colorism, it was a process to actually put those fears aside and not let them be a barrier or an obstacle to me speaking up on this topic. Now, the 5 fears that I'm going to share today are from the perspective of a dark-skinned person. Some of them apply regardless of your skin tone, regardless of your race, but then there are a few of them that are specifically, very specifically focused on some of the fears that a dark-skinned Black woman in particular might have when she thinks about talking about colorism. So the very first fear is that colorism is complex. Complexion is complex, identity is complex, race is complex. And if you don't have practice already talking about these things, if it's not something that you've had classes on or studied or been reading a lot about, the simple fear could be, where do I start? What do I even say? And especially now with things like, in present time, with things like cancel culture and people being afraid to say the wrong things and not wanting to sound ignorant or not wanting to expose their lack of knowledge or awareness, it can be really difficult for people to start having a conversation about something that they feel they're a novice in. And also thinking about something like colorism specifically, which is even less talked about than things like racism or sexism or classism. So it can be even harder to feel like you are comfortable in your level of knowledge about what the issue is to begin with. And so one way that I face this fear is kind of what I'm doing today, and starting with my own personal experience. And so to overcome that first fear, you don't necessarily have to have textbook knowledge of what colorism is, but you can talk about your own perspective and your own experiences living in your body with your particular skin tone, interacting with people of other skin tones. What was the unspoken or the spoken experiences in your family, in your household, in your community as it relates to skin tone, okay? The second fear that I had this was a very important one, and this is one of the ones that is very specific to that dark-skinned Black woman's experience, which is that I didn't want people to dismiss me as merely hating on light-skinned girls. This is a huge one. Any dark-skinned girl who has tried at any point in their life to talk about colorism has probably gotten the pushback or gotten the dismissal or gotten the accusations, oh, you're just jealous, or you're just hating on light-skinned girls, why can't you just be happy with who you are? That is a huge fear, and I also want to share this list just to acknowledge and normalize the fact that these are real instances that we face, that this kind of pushback does happen, and it happens pretty often. It happens in all the social media comments. It happens in our family dynamics. It happens if we're talking about colorism at school. Like anywhere we talk about colorism, the likelihood that someone accuses you of just hating on light-skinned girls in particular is a very real reality. So one of the ways that I overcame this fear is I talked about the fact that I have a track record of being accepting and open to everyone, right? And this is not necessary. I'll say that first. This is how I overcame this fear. But before I even go further down that path, I want to acknowledge that you don't have to address this at all. You do not have to respond to these accusations. You do not have to respond to trolls that are accusing you of only talking about colorism or only caring about this issue because you're jealous or you're hating or you're just mad at light-skinned girls. You don't even have to entertain that in conversations. And if someone throws that accusation at you, that is actually a clear sign to walk away. In the conversation right there, walk away. It's probably not worth your time, energy, or investment of your intellectual and emotional labor, okay? But if this is still a fear that you have, one thing that you can do is simply reflect for yourself. Be honest with yourself about where you stand and how you actually feel toward light-skinned women. And one thing I'll say is, if you are uncomfortable, or if you do have some anger or resentment or any kind of feelings or conflict, internal conflict when it comes to your relationships with light-skinned women, acknowledge that that is due to colorism, right? And so people who say, oh, you're just hating on light-skinned women, are completely proving the point that colorism is real. And so if that's a fear that you have, that's all the more reason for you to talk about colorism, is because that very accusation in and of itself is proof of just how people value and are biased in favor of light-skinned people, and how dismissive and how stigmatized the stigmas people have towards dark-skinned individuals. So that could actually, the fact that that accusation is out there could actually motivate you to want to educate people on what colorism really is, right? The third fear that I had when I was first starting to talk about colorism was that people often say, if you just love yourself, then you wouldn't care. You wouldn't make it an issue. And this is really closely tied to that second fear I just mentioned. And it's also very specific to dark-skinned Black women in particular. Because I noticed that even when light-skinned women talk about colorism, or when light-skinned women talk about painful experiences they've had based on their skin tone, no one, I mean absolutely no one, accuses a light-skinned woman of not loving themselves or being insecure. Even if she's talking about, oh, well, they bullied me, or I got teased, or I wasn't accepted, or I didn't fit in. No one ever hears a light-skinned person say that and says, oh, you're just hating on dark-skinned girls, or oh, you're just mad. You just need to love yourself. Don't care about what they think. You wouldn't care about this if you had high self-esteem. Just go work on yourself and stop talking about this, right? No one ever dismisses light-skinned women when they're talking about what it's like to live in their skin. Or even if the light-skinned women who are talking about the research and are talking about their privilege and are talking about colorism as the systemic problem that it is, people are so much more willing to listen to them as if they have an objective perspective on the issue, and as if their feelings and perspective are inherently valid, right? And so it's only dark-skinned women who speak up about colorism who are told that it's coming from a lack of self-love, that you're only talking about this because you don't know how to love yourself, and you only care about an issue like colorism because you value how other people perceive you or what other people think of you, right? And so the fear that I had, and that you might also have, is that you don't want to be perceived as being quote unquote weak. You don't want to be perceived as not loving yourself. You don't want people to think that you don't have high self-esteem, that you're not confident, that you let these things bother you, or that you're being too sensitive. And so you just ignore it. And some dark-skinned women even outright deny colorism for this reason, because the perspective or the pressure to be unbothered and to sort of not let anything faze you and to just be completely untouched by society is a standard that a lot of Black women, and especially dark-skinned Black women, have for ourselves. And so being willing to acknowledge, like, I can love myself and acknowledge that something hurt me at the same time. Those things are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, the argument that I have against that accusation, and one of the ways that I overcame this particular fear, is that I understood that in loving myself, I speak up for myself. It's actually a sign of self-love to say, I deserve better. I don't want you to treat me this way. You hurt me. This thing that you said is disrespectful. I deserve to be in this room just as much as anyone else. And the fact that you are discriminating against me means you need to be held accountable for that. You individually, but also you as a society, right? That is actually an act of profound self-love. So don't let anyone tell you that if you're talking about colorism and being an activist against it and advocating against it, that you just need to love yourself. You look them dead in the eye and you say, the fact that I'm holding you accountable is me loving myself. The fact that I'm demanding better from my society and my culture is me loving myself. It's an act of courageous self-love for dark-skinned women to say, colorism is a problem and I'm here to stand up against it. Okay, so now the fourth fear that I had, or the fourth this wasn't necessarily a fear, but it was something that kept me silent, something that kept me from really talking about colorism or having the courage to speak up about it, is that I often found in conversations with people, they would dismiss it with an affirmation, or they would dismiss it with a compliment. And so it's a really subtle and sort of covert way of being dismissive of conversations around colorism. So I need all people, regardless of your skin tone, gender, race, identity, I need all people to understand that the following comment is extremely dismissive. Oh girl, but you're so beautiful. You just need to see that you're beautiful, and other people will see it too, right? So the belief that telling a dark-skinned woman how beautiful she is the best response to her expressing her experiences and her emotions and feelings towards colorism, or in response to colorism, is actually not helpful. Okay, so let me not say it's not helpful. It's beside the point. So there are dark-skinned women who are still on a journey of learning to see themselves as beautiful, okay? And so yes, affirmation is absolutely helpful in that instance. But colorism is not relegated or limited to a woman's individual sense of her own beauty. That is the most narrow understanding of colorism that is floating out there in the world, is that we can solve colorism by just helping dark-skinned women feel beautiful. That's a fraction of what colorism healing is about. And actually, it completely ignores the reason that many dark-skinned women have damaged self-esteem in the first place. So focusing on a dark-skinned woman feeling beautiful without acknowledging and then addressing the reasons she didn't think she was beautiful in the first place, you are perpetuating the problem. You are supporting the status quo. It's yes, help dark-skinned women to see and recognize their beauty and their value and their worth. But if you really love those dark-skinned women, if you really care about them, you're going to acknowledge and address the systemic reality that has made it harder for them to perceive that in the first place, right? So one way to overcome that fear, or to overcome that hurdle or that obstacle, one is to do your own inner work, right? And in that moment, be able to say, I already think I'm beautiful, but colorism is bigger than that, right? That's a simple, basic statement that you can say. Or let's be candid and say that if you are someone who is still struggling to see their beauty and see their worth, you can say, I recognize that me perceiving my beauty is important work that I have to do for myself. But when I'm talking about colorism, it's not just about me, and it's not just about a woman's personal self-esteem, right? And so just continuing to send that message and spread that message that colorism includes and encompasses our perception of our own beauty, but it far surpasses that. It goes way beyond my individual experience of what I see in the mirror, right? That's a core piece of it. That's a core foundation of it for me as an individual. But when we're talking about systemic inequality and systemic oppression that has generations and centuries of being put into practice, and that has a legacy that shows no signs of slowing down, we can't just stop the conversation at, oh, you need to think you're beautiful and move on. Okay, so this fifth fear is also a really huge one. This, I think, applies to many Black women of all skin tones, but it's particularly interesting coming from a dark-skinned Black woman's perspective, because darker-skinned Black women are expected to be the strongest of Black women, right? So Black women in general are expected to be these strong, emotionally resilient people. And within the category of Black women, dark-skinned Black women are seen as the most resilient, the strongest, and the most impervious to any sort of feeling or emotion. And so one fear that I had that kept me silent about colorism for so long was being afraid to be perceived as weak. Again, this is related to some of the other fears or hurdles or obstacles I had to overcome in order to find the courage to be outspoken about colorism. And one, I want to say that it is, again, going back to the self-love conversation, it's actually a sign of courage and strength to express where you've been hurt and to demand that society treat you in a way that you actually deserve, right? And so vulnerability is strength, and you're actually doing revolutionary work as a dark-skinned Black woman when you speak about where you've been hurt, when you speak about your vulnerabilities. That is actually revolutionary work. And for every dark-skinned woman who opens up about her feelings of feeling pain, sadness, grief, about colorism and other things, is actually doing the revolutionary work of changing the narrative that we are impervious to these things in the first place, okay? So this is a video for people who are dark-skinned and want to be able to share their story either out in public, kind of like I'm doing, or just with their close friends and family, but have some hesitations and are kind of afraid. There are also some, I think, more aggressive reactions and responses that I didn't touch on here. Again, this is based on a blog post I wrote about my personal fears and hurdles around talking about colorism. But let me know if you want to have a follow-up video where I talk more about those instances where people are aggressive and where family starts to disown you, right? All those like more extreme, more violent, more volatile reactions that we get as dark-skinned women who talk about colorism. But I think these 5 are very, very common, and everyone just about has experienced them at some point as dark-skinned women who are honest about colorism as an issue out in the world, but also in our personal lives. So I'll be back with a second video about what I told myself to find the courage to speak up. But right now, again, the purpose of this video was kind of to give you a preview of how to overcome these fears, but mainly just to normalize them and acknowledge them, and just acknowledge the fact that it is really difficult sometimes to face all of the pushback and the resistance and the dismissal, the dismissiveness and the apathy that we get as dark-skinned women who talk about colorism. And if you are new to this channel, please subscribe and like this video if you received any value from it. I have an archive of videos that you can check out if you want to dive deeper on colorism specifically, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.